Hey guys, I've already done a video mentioning the basics of thrust and throwing a thrust, particularly to do with initiative, line and plane. Now we're going to go into a bit more detail on the different sorts of thrusts and the different combinations. So Bain's going to start off with that.
Please watch that video before you watch this one. It's important. What we're going to go through here is the different types of thrusts you can throw. This should be fairly short because we're not going to go into the intricate mechanics of each one. We might do that in a separate video, but it's important to know what sort of thrust you can throw. The sort of thrust you can throw is called a pull cue thrust. There's a teardrop thrust, a corkscrew thrust, and an around the world. We'll go through the mechanics of each one of those. So pull cue thrust is the standard thrust that we'll all throw, and that effectively is to allow your front hand to open, your back hand to slide through it, and then strike your opponent. The technique for pull cue thrust is important. The idea is that the tip and the length of the weapon should be in line with your opponent's eyes, so that all they see is an expanding dot in front of them, thus minimizing their ability to actually react to it. If you throw a pull cue thrust and your opponent can see the length of the weapon, they have more to visualize and they can actually cue off it easier. So you want to try and minimize that as much as you can. Again, coming up to my opponent, pull cue thrust. Standard thrust technique, very, very similar to fencing, certainly the way that I use it. What I'm doing is I want to kick off with my feet and my shoulder and start my hand movement all at the same time. This is important because if I kick first, then he knows the thrust is coming. If I lead with my shoulder first before I take the step and then move my hands, they know it's coming. If I thrust without moving my body, completely legitimate, that's fine, but I really limit the range that I can actually deploy. Ideally, what I want to be doing whenever I thrust is everything coming forward at the same time. Make sense? So again, pull cue thrust, and Josh, if you want to do the same thing. And again. Right. The second one we do is a teardrop thrust. It's called a teardrop because of the shape the head actually makes. What you're doing here is traversing out and around and back in a teardrop shape. So if there's a piece of chalk out here, it would make a teardrop. You can teardrop up and you can teardrop down. The important part of this is that unlike a pull cue thrust, which is only going effectively through one dimension straight, this is now going through 2 dimensions. So that makes it harder to actually block. So a teardrop thrust, so if I'm teardrop thrusting to the leg, it will be bang, and if I'm teardrop thrusting to the head, it might be again. And back. Cool. And again, if you want to throw a teardrop.
You can combine them too. You can do this and then do the normal pull cue at the end of it.
And that's what Josh did. That's a habit of ours because we very rarely throw a thrust that is simply just a thrust. There is always a combination of these activities. The next one that gets kind of cool is the corkscrew thrust. I'm going to show you in a couple of different positions here. What effectively I'm trying to do is make the tip make a corkscrew motion in against my opponent. So this is great against other poles. So this is the move that I'm actually making. So I do it slowly again. This is the move. Okay? Now there's a few things that is actually happening here. One is that I'm not just moving forward, but I'm moving around the actual tip itself. So as I'm actually coming across, we're actually fighting. Tips up here, come around to my opponent. Yep. So, and the important part of this is that a pull cue thrust only goes through 1 dimension. A teardrop thrust goes through 2. A corkscrew thrust goes through 3. What that makes it is far harder to track, and if you adjust your timing slower or faster, you get a far better result as well. So a slow corkscrew or fast corkscrew. So I'll get Josh to show the same shot so you can see it from the other side. The last one is we call around the world. Now around the world is a little bit deceptive. It's really good against sword and shieldsmen, also good against polearmsmen. And what you're doing here is doing a tight circle, a large circle, like this around your opponent's weapon. Now, the trick to this one is seeing how your opponent cues. If your opponent cues off your weapon and likes to track it, this is the shot for you. Okay, because if he tracks my weapon, he comes up behind it, and then it's in front of him. Yep. So do that again real slow. Tracks my weapon. Except I got it that time because I'm trying to do it slow. And then behind. Yep. And that's why it's called an around the world. Now for the thrust, all we're trying to do is make sure that we're in a position, we're moving forward, he's watching my weapon, not seeing me close the actual distance, and then I'm in a position just to do a chop thrust to his head. So, with that in mind, around the world, and again the secret to around the world is being able to know your opponent's speed and the fact that they track off you. If your opponent is fairly new, your around the world will look like this. I'm exaggerating. Because they really do need to cue it. Where if your opponent is quite a top-end fighter, what you'll find is your around the world's really quick. Yep, because they will just track the tip ever so slightly. Okay?
Just enough to get them offline, and you can get in.
So that's the basics of thrusts. You've got your pull cue thrust, you've got your teardrop thrust, and you've got your corkscrew thrust, and then you've got your around the world. They're the standard thrusts that we throw. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.